Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to go ahead and get started with our Education and Culture work session. This is a follow-up work session on our Office of Legislative Oversight report, Montgomery County Public Schools Performance and Opportunity Gaps. Back in December of last year, we had a work session and received a copy of the Office of Legislative Oversight report. I really want to thank Dr. Elaine Bonner-Tompkins for great work as always. Our Office of Legislative Oversight always does a phenomenal job in terms of really honing in on a lot of different issues that are incredibly important to the county and gives us some great thinking points about next steps for us and how we can better ourselves as a county as a whole. And so I really appreciate working with our school system. I know that you had to get a lot of data points and all kinds of things from them, so I appreciate the partnership that's there. And I really do appreciate my colleagues really rolling up their sleeves and taking a great look at what it is that we continue to need to do to better our school system as a whole. And I say that because as a member of the Kerwin Commission, over the past 3 years, we've looked at the state of Maryland as a whole and said, how can our education system be even better for our students? The reality is we know that there is no jurisdiction throughout this nation that is doing everything possible that's, well, not doing everything possible, that has been able to eliminate our achievement, equity, opportunity gaps that we see in our system. While they've made strides, and Montgomery County certainly has been one of those that has made great strides, we still have so much more work that needs to be done. That is the reality. It's the reason why the Kerwin Commission put forth the recommendations that it did, that the National Center on Education and the Economy, as well as many others, have said truly is a blueprint for the nation in terms of taking us to the next level. I really appreciate that I've seen throughout the state of Maryland, and especially here in Montgomery County, an embracing of some of the Kerwin Commission recommendations and already starting to focus on some of those and including those in last year's budget and making some of those changes. But even before then, some of those same principles were there. The focus on early childhood education and understanding how important that was, and having leaders like Councilmember Navarro, who's been focused on that issue for a very, very long time, not just here on the council, but when she was also on the Board of Education, and even before that in private sector, and so from that, well, nonprofit, I should say. But so from that perspective, I really want us to focus today, and I know that the school system is going to be doing a presentation about some of the things that they see in the report, but I really want to talk about the future. I really want to talk about where we go from here. That needs to be our focus. Our focus should be on how we're going to continue to make our system better for all of our kids. The embracing of the all means all by our school system is the first step in the multitude of recommendations that I know are going to come out in terms of how we can make our system better for everyone. And we play our own part. The work that the council has continued to do outside of the school system's budget in terms of even focusing on a simple thing like school nurses. But we know how much those matter to our schools, to the well-being of our children, and that Be Well 365 model that continues to support the overall child means that we have to have those structures in place. And so the county council responding with focusing on those efforts means a lot as well. These are all things that we know are important when it comes to whether it's after-school recreation activities at schools, whether it comes to ensuring that our teachers are paid commensurate with the level and profession that they have and the importance and the role that they play in our schools. All of these things are all encompassed together in terms of what we need to certainly focus on. And so I, again, really want to thank you, Dr. Bonner-Tompkins, again, for providing us very salient points in which we can focus on to say, how can we do better? How can we build upon some of the successes that we've had in our schools and make it even better for all of our kids, as well as some of the places where we continue to struggle? And let's think about those and think about methodologies, different kinds of programs and investment resources that can go to some of those areas to certainly help them to bring them up to speed, because we know that we as a community are only as good as our weakest link. That's the reality, and that's what we'll be judged by. There are plenty of communities all across the nation that have, and across the world, that have super successful people. And if you judge them just based solely on those super successful people, we wouldn't be moving our communities forward. We have to focus on those that unfortunately are at the bottom and make sure that we can bring them up to a level in which we all feel is a level of success. And I don't feel as though we've got that for everyone right now. I think we all can admit that. And so from that perspective, we're all working together to make sure we get to that point. So with that, I'm going to turn over to my colleagues to see if they have any opening comments before turning it over to Dr. Rhonda Tompkins and then to our guests.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Dr. Smith, and everybody here who is present to have this second session as we review the OLO report. I want to thank Dr. Elaine Bonner-Tompkins also for her work. I think she has a pretty strong track record in providing us with information and data that we can then use to better make decisions about not just budget allocations, but how do we work together to enhance and improve our outcomes. I think that this is by nobody can doubt that this has been lifelong career goals for many of us and many of the people in this room. I mean, that's why we're here. That is our job. So I appreciate members of the Board of Education also being here as well to have this conversation. I think that, as I wrapped up my year in the presidency, there was no doubt that we were able to come together to improve and to launch some really important pieces of legislations and initiatives. And so you mentioned the early childhood education initiative that is so critical because we understand that the data is very clear and what happens when many students show up in your doorsteps at kindergarten. And so we are very much aware that there's a lot of work we have to do in the 0 to 5 space. And then, of course, the racial equity and social justice legislation was important for us because then it provides us with a framework, instead of just having ad hoc conversations or sessions about these issues, because they do disproportionately affect Black and Brown students, that we hold ourselves accountable through data at every step of the way. So to me, that was why this legislation was so important. And although I'm sure we'll talk about this, I know the board also has a policy. And of course, I'm still very interested, and I've had conversations with President Evans about this, that to the extent that the board can perhaps amend the policy so it mirrors what we're trying to do, which is very simple. It's just that every single time you make a budgetary decision or a policy decision, that you would have data, an impact note of sorts, where you're constantly tracking how each decision either helps or exacerbates the disparities that exist. And so I think that would be really cool if MCPS could align that as well, because it helps not only the board, but it also helps us when we're trying to make these budgetary decisions or when we're out in the community explaining why we decided to raise our hand and adopt a particular budget level. I really think that would be critical. But make no mistake, I do believe that we are in a really critical moment in time in our county. I have not had the privilege and pleasure of attending some of those boundary study meetings, but I have been tracking it. And I think that, the conversations that we have to have, in my personal opinion, should be centered around, how do we do an audit of the resources and the initiatives that each school has, so that we can ensure that no matter where you live, no matter which school you go to, you have access to those opportunities, that you have access to the best possible education. I'm still trying to track and understand how this conversation about segregation is playing out, because mathematically I keep thinking about how we're a county that is majority of color, so I don't know how that works. I mean, most of the schools I go to, they're majority kids of color. And so as far as I'm concerned, we've got to start talking about what it is that we're investing, how we're investing it, how we're providing the supports. To me, that's the conversation I like to have. And no doubt, make sure that we're able to have a mechanism to identify capacity. If there is capacity within a cluster or something like that, that we can do that. But I worry that a lot of the conversation out there has gotten a bit simplified, and also we're not being realistic about who we are in the county. And we have best practices. We have schools where things have been done that have proven that even the school with the highest farm at one point in time, Joey Lelick, which was Broad Acres and was used for that case study, highest farms rate, and took it on and really saw some amazing results. So we know we can do that. So to me, that's what I'm really interested in, is how do we now just hold hands and acknowledge who we are and acknowledge that we have the know-how and the capacity, if we're courageous enough, to make some difficult decisions to ensure that every single school has the best possible setup for that school to be excellent, and not start pitting communities against other communities in the name of some, great thing that has been read somewhere about being woke. That's not what this is about. And so I appreciate everybody being here. I know that Councilmember Rice has been holding, the fort over there in Annapolis, and we're really looking forward to see what happens with Kerwin. But we have amazing opportunity, I think, in front of us. Nonetheless, I do worry that we are continuing to operate under the same framework that we have operated forever. And that doesn't work anymore. So thank you so much for everything that you do day in and day out to get us to that better place. Thank you.
Councilmember Juando.
Thank you, Councilmember Rice and Councilmember Navarro, and thank you, Superintendent, Deputy Superintendent, School Board President, and all the school board members who are here. I'll be very brief. I'm glad we're having this follow-up session. We got a report from OLO that highlighted where, it's a snapshot of where we are related to our most vulnerable populations, where we need to make the most gain, which we all agree. Our students of color, our Latino students, our Black African American students, our students with disabilities, our low-income students, our limited English proficient students. We all agree. I know everyone at this table and in this room, and hopefully everyone watching, knows that it is our moral imperative, but also our economic imperative, to eliminate those gaps and expand opportunity for all students. So we're all on the same page there. We also know that we need to track how we're doing and how we're spending our money in a vast amount of resources, right? Half of our budget here in the county against those goals, and that there should be public transparency and agreement about where we are. And the thing that I want to get to today, personally, I'm hoping we can make some progress in for the members of the public and going forward, anyone that views this later, is to understand where have we made progress, where haven't we made the progress, and be very transparent about that. And then to the extent that there's disagreement on how we're spending resources towards those goals of shrinking and eliminating those gaps, that we can understand that better here today. And I know you all are prepared to address that in the conversation, because I think that's critically important. We spend a lot of resources, and probably not enough, on educating our students, but we need to have the accountability and understanding and common language of where we are and how we got here and where we need to go. And then also, okay, then how do we do better? How do we do more? But I think it's hard, and when we talk to our residents and the people we represent, with the changing demographics and all this stuff going on, we need to be able to forthrightly answer those questions in a systematic way, using the same common language with no ambiguity. And so I think that's where I'm hoping we can get as well, in furtherance of our shared goal that I know we all share, to make sure all of our kids, that all means all, to quote you, Superintendent Smith. So I'm excited about this, and I appreciate the work that's been done. I'm hoping we can hone in on that. And I have some specific questions as we go along, but I don't want to belabor. I want you all to be able to start. So thank you very much.
Dr. Bonner-Tompkins, I'll turn it over to you.
Good afternoon. My name is Elaine Bonner-Tompkins, and I appreciate this opportunity to help staff this follow-up conversation regarding MCPS performance and opportunity gaps OLO report that we released late last year. So before passing the mantle on to the MCPS team, I just wanted to remind folks about what was the purpose of the report that we did last year, and to give a recap of our 4 key findings. So the council tasked OLO to review MCPS data and student performance and resource allocations to better understand how MCPS targets its resources to narrow performance gaps among student subgroups. OLO Report 2019-14 describes trends in MCPS performance among student subgroups, and opportunity gaps relative to school enrollment and per-student funding for special education, compensatory education, and English for speakers of other language programs, ESOL programs. There were 4 key findings that emerged from the information we reviewed. The first was that enrollment among Latinx, Black, low-income, and English learning students is concentrated among MCPS's higher poverty schools. The second finding was that over time, performance gaps by race, ethnicity, and service group have either stagnated or widened across a majority of the performance measures reviewed. Our third finding, and perhaps this one is the most contentious, is that ESOL and compensatory education programs designed to narrow performance gaps by English language proficiency and income are underfunded relative to student need. And our fourth finding was that the underfunding of ESOL and compensatory education programs disproportionately impacts MCPS's higher poverty schools as well as the students that they enroll. So with that, I will pass on time for the MCPS team to go through their presentation.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bonner-Tompkins. So I want to thank our superintendent, Dr. Jack Smith, our deputy superintendent, Dr. Monifa McKnight, as well as our president of the Board of Education, Ms. Shebra Evans. I know that in attendance we have with us members of the school board, Dr. Judy Daca, Caller Silvestre, Brenda, and did I miss? Rebecca Swindrowski, I'm so sorry. And we have, and Jeanette Dixon that's here, and then, don't see anybody else from the board now. Okay. I will just say that it's very interesting because I actually had a conversation with Nate Tenbite at our Martin Luther King program at Strathmore. And we talked specifically about this. And it was very interesting to get a student perspective when it comes to an analysis of our Office of Legislative Oversight report, but then also a student perspective as to where we are. And I think that it's very interesting to say that a lot of students feel, may not be accurate or not, and so this is something that we'll need to tackle. A lot of students feel that are in higher poverty schools that they somehow are at a disadvantage compared to other schools that are non-high poverty and non-majority of color. And so that's an interesting dynamic. That I think it helps us to have this conversation, right, to show some of the facts that are out there in terms of the investment that Montgomery County Public Schools is making in our schools that are some predominantly lower income as well as predominantly students of color, because that's what folks think out there. And it also is fueling this conversation around boundary studies and boundary changes that somehow going to a school that may be higher in percentage in terms of people of color or lower income means somehow that you're not going to get the same resources as another school that may not be made up the same way. And so that's why this is timely. As Councilmember Jawando was alluding to, it's important for us to dispel those myths. But to also justify in some cases about how there may be some inequities and how we intend to fix that and how we intend to put more investment, because no one will argue about spending more in those areas where we have predominantly more students that are of lower income. We know that there are more challenges that a lot of those students face, and so we expect more investment to be in those areas. And so that should be what the end result should be, regardless of where we are now. The fact of the matter is where we need to be in terms of making sure that we're addressing all of our kids. So I just wanted to lay that out there because I think that what our conversation about is incredibly important just for our education space as a whole, but it also ties directly into a conversation that we're having across this county right now when it comes to education and boundaries. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Dr. Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Rice and members of the Education and Culture Committee. Today, our board president, Ms. Evans, is going to start with remarks, and then Dr. McKnight and I will walk through a series of sets of information quickly and to make sure that during and after the slides, we have plenty of time for conversations. Thanks.
Well, thank Thank you for having us. It's always a pleasure to be here. You all are always so welcoming, and you're definitely partners in education. Is it on? Yes. Okay.
Some of them pick up.
Oh, okay. Okay. I thought I touched it right. The red light's on. Yeah, but just appreciate our partnership that we have. Just very collaborative. We always keep our lines of communication open. And today, I appreciate the feedback that I heard from Chair Rice and from Councilmember Navarro, as well as Councilmember Wiljuwando. We are very committed to talking today about what we're doing, the progress that we've made. We have more than 166,000 students in our public school system, and we want to do what's right. It brings me back to our mission. Our mission is to make certain that every student is academically prepared with the creative problem-solving skills as well as the social and emotional skills to be able to go on for college, for a career, and just be able to thrive in their community. We have our core values that we stand behind: learning, relationships, excellence and equity, and of course respect. And we believe that what's infused in all the work that we do is excellence and equity. You know, you cannot serve your students well if you don't have those two core values stand out, and they stand out here in MCPS. I can attest to that. I've enjoyed working on the board. I have 2 girls in the public school system, and we have an equity policy. You mentioned that, and that was one of the things that we did not see mentioned in the OLO report. We just wanted to highlight that. We wanted to make certain that, you know, in all that we do, that there's access and opportunity to resources for our students, because without it, they cannot strive and meet their full potential. You know, with our policy, the board revised it back in 2017, and we talk about our commitment to each student and the action steps that we're going to take in order to make certain that our commitment is realized. And so we felt like our policy aligned with the Racial Equity and Social Justice Act that you all put in place here in the county. You know, I can't speak enough about the support that we get year in and year out around our budget, because we know that you believe in a quality public education, and that makes our county strong, and it continues to make our schools strong when we have the investments that we need. So I just really want you all to know that we're doing this work, that there is progress being made, and it's not where we want to be, but we are making significant strides, and we felt like the OLO report missed that. And so Dr. Smith and Dr. McKnight, they will touch upon the work that we're doing and what we're going to do to continue to make that progress here in Montgomery County. We believe it's a great school system. You can tell we're bursting at the seams because everybody wants to be here. We're ranked 14th in the district, and we want to continue to make it a premier school system. So with that, I will hand it over to Dr. Smith.
Thank you, Ms. Evans. So we just want to walk through some areas of our work that I think both illustrate the disparities and gaps that have existed and continue to persist. I had quite a long editorial in the Washington Post last year about that very fact. And that's something on February 4th, 2016, when the Board of Education named my name in public and then kind of shoved me in front of a whole bunch of cameras. People said, well, what do you think? I said, it's a great school system for so many kids for so long, not all. And I've probably said that 10,000 times since then. And I think, so really today what we want to do is just show some of the underlying work that's been done, that's moving for kids. We're by no means where we need to be. But we're not the same school system we were 20 years ago. And I want to talk about that for just a minute because I think it's critically important. We have 166,300 students now. That's our September 30th number. And that's, another 1,000 kids in the last, since October 1st, the last 4 months. But we want to serve, and we're committed to serving every single student that walks to our front door. That's our job. And that idea of unleashing potential and expanding opportunities is critical. We print that on everything. And much of what we're going to show you today is about access or participation. Some of it's going to be about making progress, and some of it's going to be about actual high levels of learning or achievement and how we think about that. But I would be totally remiss if I in any way implied we are where we need to be for all of our students of color, all of our students in poverty. We're not. And that's a critical factor. But we do want to while we maintain that urgency, we also want to pause and recognize and call out areas that are working well in the school system, where we see growth that's going to have an effect on the state test numbers. Much of what's in the OLL report, those are going to keep coming every year. In fact, there's a new test this spring. In April, we'll give an entirely new test. So we'll all have to have a conversation about what that means, because I'm not ready to declare that the new test will be completely comparable to the PARCC test. And so we'll have to just study it and look at it. But we have a lot of different measures we look at in order to help people understand. We're going to talk earliest learners, pre-K, all the way through 12th grade. And if we just look at our school system 20 years ago, I'm going to call just one number out to you. 7,167 students in 1999 were engaged in AP assessments. That was about, of the 1999 number, 6% of the students. 41,048 students are engaged today. That's about 25% of the student body. And that's a profound number, because when we talk about our youngest learners, and Dr. Navarro and I just spent all morning down in Silver Spring talking about pre-K and our efforts and the efforts of this county that I recognized while I was down there to grow our pre-K over the last several years, and how we need to get to pre-K for everyone. When we talk about that, pre-K is an entry point for that number. If you get pre-K, you're more likely to be part of that number. We know that without any doubt. And how do we do that across the board? I also just want to say, and I say this, I've said it several times in the last 2 weeks as I've been out in the community at different events. When we look at these numbers and people talk about changing demographics and shifting populations, all that is fine. We serve students. Our students are just as talented, just as aspirational, just as smart and capable as they have ever been in Montgomery County or anywhere else. The change in poverty and the change in English acquisition means we have to front load with more services at their entry point. But remember, it's not where we enter, it's where we finish that's important. And this school system's done a very fine job of that, and this county has done a fine job of that over the last 20 years of growing programs. But we can't stop now. We have to keep making sure that we're providing a lot of services as children in poverty, children who have not been served and not been given access, primarily children of color, and children who are learning English get the most significant services as they walk in the door. You know, we have a lot of examples across the system of things, and we just want to show you a few of these. When we talk about these, our students, I've been to about 40-some graduations in the last 3 years. At every single graduation, they recognize the students who are going to college and the military, who've completed career pathways. We have students in every high school every year who go to the most competitive colleges in this country. Every single year. We have seniors who compete at the highest levels for assessments. We have blue ribbon schools, and we have the highest level of accomplishment in STEM. We also have students who are really having tremendous success once they leave us in all sorts of areas, whether it's in university, companies. It goes back, though, I think, to what you said, Mr. Rice, and that is we can't only look at that. We have to look at where we're not reaching every student. And we've really focused on that in the system for many years. In the last few years, we have really worked to make that an area of concentrated work. And we just want to talk about that. This quote, you know, so many MCPS students achieve at the highest levels, but not all, led us to all means all, and it led us to this framework, which has given us a lot of clear information about students, student populations, individual students, about schools, and for the previous up till September or October of this year, for a year and a half, about our equity allocations. And the reason we need to do that is because we need to answer the questions that are asked in this report and that you've asked today. what are we doing with our resources, and to what degree are they meeting the needs of students? And when we talk about resources, we're not only talking about books and materials and equipment, we're also talking about staffing and the expertise of staff. We're talking about all of those things in our school system right now. And I would agree with you. I think the boundary analysis is critical to know the state of MCPS, and where there are opportunities, particularly around economic disparities in adjacent schools and space that we need to use, we ought to pay close attention to that. However, that is not a single solution. That is not going to change the world. What changes the world is what happens in a classroom, a hallway, a school building, a cafeteria, a school for a student. And so as we think about all of this, building this foundation has been critically important, and we just want to go through quickly with some of the foundational elements. Dr. McKnight is going to talk for a minute about the issue of poverty and compensatory education. I would just start that conversation by saying, as we look at the blueprint for Maryland's future, certainly how the state of Maryland handles compensatory education is under a real deep discussion right now in those formulas. And I think that's a good thing. And I think it's one of the things that will move us forward as we can get this legislation passed and moving out into our school systems. Dr. McKnight?
Good afternoon, County Council members. It's good to be here today, and I just wanted to take a moment to just really talk about the compensatory education aid that Dr. Bonner Tompkins referred to in the report. That really was an opportunity for us to really clarify a little bit of how we look at that funding and utilize it in the school system, and some of the gains, but yet some of the ways that we look at it not in a very isolated or siloed way, but in how we use it abroad in the system to serve all of the needs of our students. So the first thing I'll start with is when we think about compensatory aid, the state is actually giving flexibility to districts to be able to make this very unrestricted funding for the purpose of, oftentimes you don't just have students in one service group that are going to utilize the aid of compensatory funding. And so with that, we look at it in a very unrestricted way in terms of how we utilize it. We're not aware of any other district in the state of Maryland that applies compensatory aid to just farm students, which is much like us. We just don't apply it to farm students. And we often have many of our farm students that fall into many other categories, like ESOL and special education. And so not only do we have students fall into different categories, but it's more often, probably never, that we have a school in the school system that does not have a student who falls into several of those service groups, even if it's not a Title I or focus school. So that's something that we have to remember as we think about it. As we think about compensatory education, it's determined by October 31st, the official reporting to the State of Maryland Department of Education in terms of what the funding is. But interesting enough, we have economically disadvantaged students in every school and in every service group. Since November 1st of this year, up to date, we have received over 2,400 free and reduced meals designations for our students. 2,400. So again, since November 1st, I can tell you that we have that many students who've received their free and reduced meals designation, and I can promise you that they're all not in Title I or focus schools. They are in every school that exists within the district. So that's something that we just have to be mindful of as we think about all of the needs and how we have to be very flexible in servicing all of our students wherever they are in the district. So with that said, I just wanted to bring us back as we talk about the compensatory aid. Back in 2015, the Senate drafted a letter stating that the school system should be commended for its ongoing efforts to equitably distribute resources. So in a growing school system that requires us to continually identify barriers we have contributed to this gap over the years, we have a responsibility to continue to look at that. And so while we know that we won't close the gap overnight, we'll work hard like we can and continue to look at that, but most importantly look at what is happening as a result of the practices that we put in place to see what is the outcome of things that we put in place to try and change those practices that may have contributed to the gap over the years. So one thing that we did last year, we commissioned a resource study because as a system, we wanted to take the opportunity to say, all right, how are we using our resources and are we using them in the best way that we can to serve all of our students? And in that study last year, it was stated that MCPS provides more incremental funding for students and schools in poverty than peer districts across the nation. So that says a lot, but doesn't say that that's everything that we can do. So I just wanted to point that out because it was one of the reasons we commissioned the study. And so with that said, there were some other things that were noted in the study. Like, for instance, the study also showed us that there was an opportunity for us to look at how we looked at the allocation of resources more so on the secondary level than we currently do the elementary level. And so we've been looking at our practices, which again was the purpose of the resource study, to say how do we do that. And so we've been thinking about different practices as if, I'll give you a couple examples. For our elementary students, we know a lot about them and what their needs are in the elementary school, but our question that we've been looking at in terms of what we learned from the resource study is how do we make sure that funding that we know that is required for those elementary students actually follow them to the middle and high school level. So that's been, a real area for us to continue to look at that we learned from the study. That was an opportunity. Another area that we've been looking at is the investment in our novice teachers. Knowing that our novice teachers are oftentimes in our highly impacted schools, the resource study also pointed out to us the professional development that we're providing for principals and those who lead the schools. How are we looking at the investment that they're making in our novice teachers, and what does that investment look like, and how does it pay off for the teachers and how they're able to best serve those students? And so, again, I just wanted to highlight, while we were recognized in the resource study for leading in some ways, it also pointed out some areas of focus for us that we are looking at. So with that said, we're going to further examine some examples of,
I'm going to actually stop right there because I think that there's some, what I'd like to do is for each of these larger salient points to actually address some of those. And I know there's some questions and comments, and I'll start off. So part of the conversation, this is a really tough one in the education space as a whole. So you've got people that are all across the board. I will tell you that on the Kerwin Commission, there were folks who were like, money has to follow the child. Others were like, we need to be focused on concentrations of poverty and put the money there. And so there's different schools of thought that are certainly out there. But the key in the whole, in all of this is, at the end of the day, what folks do agree with is a school, and it's kind of what I said in terms of my opening remarks, a school that has high concentrations of poverty, high levels of English language learners should certainly receive more than a school that doesn't, because of all the things that you've said. And so the question is whether or not it's tied directly to compensatory education money following the child. Can you ensure that the resources are ultimately there that are necessary to give the additional training for teachers, the additional paras that you may have in the school that are necessary, some additional folks that are going to be social workers working with the parents to ensure that they can provide homework assistance and all of those accoutrements that go along with, right? I'm not as necessarily hung up in the philosophy around the compensatory education funding formula following the child from that perspective in terms of, well, this concentration has to be, but we do have to have the resources that are there. And that's kind of what was reflected in the report. Are the resources there in totality that are necessary to combat some of the challenges that those students face?
There are significantly more resources in focus and Title I schools at the elementary level than in non-focus schools. So that 0 to 35% poverty, or 1% to 35%, 35% to 65%, 65 and above. When we look at the resource allocation study, it clearly showed that. I mean, it's pretty profound, the difference. We continue to look at the other support areas, and one of the things that, as we look forward to Kerwin and in our budget here locally, trying to stay ahead of Kerwin, is to look at how we're going to handle community schools, how we're going to grow innovative calendar schools that work, for many more days during the year. I won't say year-round, but much closer to year-round than non-focused schools. As Dr. McKnight said, we are taking a very hard look at middle and high schools, because while there is some difference, it's not nearly as marked, and I think that's an area of real potential for us as a school system, is to look at that as a system. Even though I just shared with you, we have kids from every high school who go to the most competitive colleges in the nation. We have more students in some schools than others who come to us with fewer resources, fewer opportunities, and that's why it's so compelling that we do our work in the elementary and middle school to mitigate and eliminate those access points for students, and their create greater possibilities for progress at the elementary and middle as we go forward.
I will just close with, and Councilmember Navarro's talked about this in the framework of the our equity and social justice piece. That look, and everyone knows this. Our county is growing, and it's growing at a lower income spectrum. The difference between us and Howard County is actually growing, and they're growing higher income earners, whereas we are growing lower income earners. And so that means that when the school system grows, it's actually growing with that need that you just espoused when you were talking about the large number of students with free and reduced meals who are registering just like that since November. We see that in all of our county, which means that it's going to continue in that direction, and it highlights the need for us when it comes to addressing these particular issues. So it's at the forefront of what we're doing in terms of our work of providing the additional resources, and it ties that it also needs to be reflected in the school system's focus, especially with our middle and high schools. Let me turn to Councilmember Jawando and then Councilmember Navarro if she has any questions or comments.
Thank you, Mr. Rice. And thank you for, I just wanted to hone in on the compensatory education point, the slide we're on before we move past it. And if you're going to address this later, just tell me that. But the point was raised that you cannot use you can't tie compensatory education funding just to farm students. And you raised that because you have students in multiple groups. I think the suggestion was that you should, and I don't want to mischaracterize, you can jump in too. And so I think we need to talk about that for a second. And I know you mentioned some statewide review in the context of Kerwin. Why can you not do that, and why should you not do that? Can you elaborate on that?
Sure.
And why you don't think that's the right approach?
So I'll give you an example later in the presentation in terms of the complexities of when you silo compensatory aid. It has you look at a student as if they are representing just one area, like one student who's impacted maybe in one way, when the fact of the matter is we know that's not the case. So I'll give you an example. Like, for instance, mandated special education services are much greater than special education revenue. Same thing we can talk about here for compensatory aid. If you are just applying the aid that you get for that one area, but you have a student who has needs that exceed that one area, maybe two, maybe three, then to be able to say I'm aligning that aid to just this group of students, it just does not give you a clear picture of exactly how you are addressing the needs of one group of students. We don't have students that oftentimes are just impacted just in one area. If we had students who came to us beautifully bundled and say, you are only impacted in this way, and so we're going to tie dollars to us providing support for you because you are impacted, because you are receiving free and reduced meals, then it takes out the picture of everything else we have to do for that student if it's a student who also receives special education services, if it's a student who also is an ESOL student. And so it's very difficult to do because, again, you narrow the lens of the student.
It reduces the amount of support for that student if you were to do that. Is that what you're saying?
Absolutely. That's one factor. And yeah.
I'm sorry, go ahead, Dr. Smith.
I was just going to say that we have small schools and large schools, and we have students in poverty at every level, and the state compensatory model was set up, and if you look at the background of it in 2003 under the Bridge to Excellence, was set up so that you can use that money across all schools to meet the needs of all learners. That's what the goal was, with the correlation between poverty and areas of disparity in learning, lower reading levels, those sorts of things, then you're using money everywhere in all schools to meet the needs of students who need that support. And as you referenced, then as we look at Kerwin, there is more interest in having more of the money around critical masses of students in poverty, as well as providing systems in the formulas to meet the broad-based school need. Because what you're really trying to do is balance all the funds so you get to every student. That's the goal, and that's how Bridge to Excellence was written. And so over time, I think that we're going to continue to see shifts, and I frankly personally welcome those shifts in how those state formulas are structured on behalf of students. I think that's what this is what's most important in this whole conversation. And the number of students, as you indicated, that are in poverty in our school system has grown, and it shifts, each day, actually, each month, and then each year we have to look. And next year, for example, we're going to have more Title I schools. We just don't have any choice but to move that number so that more of them are served, which will likely result in more focus schools as well. And all of those schools get significant differentials in staffing and other resources. We've also put in the budget for next year a very first step of opportunities for students because of the disparities that exist across especially elementary schools in field trips and other experiences. And I would say the county PTA has worked very closely with us on that. And so for the first time, we're going to look at how do you create a kind of public-private partnership around creating that sort of experience for kids, so that where it exists in the community, you don't need to supplement it. Where it doesn't exist in the community, you do need to supplement it. And so a lot of different ways of thinking about that and how we support students across every school that we have.
There was one more point I wanted to make, Councilmember Jawando, in terms of why you wouldn't just want to tie students to the compensatory aid. We also have to remember that FARMS is a self-reporting system. And so it depends on the fact that we have families and students who feel comfortable reporting that. I always tend to say, when you look at your FARMS rate, you might want to be on the safe side to assume that realistically, right, realistically you're working with a number that is lower than what you're actually working with. So if we were to place or place aid in a way that we're aligning it just specifically to students who are being impacted by a self-reported system, the risk there would also be possibly not providing some students with what they need.
So can I just add, so there's a conversation here around sort of tying resources explicitly to a student and they being sort of portable when they move around, versus what the report also suggests is to apply compensatory ed to high poverty schools. And so high poverty schools include FARMS eligible students and FARMS ineligible students. Mm-hmm. And in fact, much of how you all fund compensatory education goes towards that end, where you talk about additional classroom teachers, additional paras. And so I just want to make sure that we're not drawing a false equivalence here of sort of the idea that if we increase compensatory education, the allocation of state compensatory aid to actual students in schools, that we're somehow going to, it has to require some difficulty that can't be resolved. That's point one. And then the second point I wanted to make was that it's important to think about this idea that we might undercount the number of students who are eligible for FARMS, and therefore we don't want to spend all the compensatory ed on those students. I would suggest that it's just the opposite, that if we already know that it's undercounted, that's all the more reason to target the resources. And then the last point I wanted to make is that the idea that there aren't students who are only eligible for FARMS, that they are eligible for special ed or English language learners, that I haven't seen any data that suggests that more than half of FARMS students are also eligible for something else. students who are eligible, there are a subset of students who are eligible for just farms. That's number one. And number two, those students are concentrated in schools that disproportionately serve our Black and brown children. And so the funding and support of those students impact the other students who are in that school. And so I think it's important to recognize that when compensatory education is not maximally funded, it's not just the students who are eligible for farms in those schools that are impacted, it's also their peers that are enrolled in their schools as well.
You know, it's an interesting point because that's part of the discussion that we had, and I keep going. I hate keep going back to Kerwin, but it's what happens when you're there for 3 years, and they become ingrained in your mind. But those are the fundamental conversations. It's around, well, even in a school to where you have a person who's not eligible for farms, who's not an English language learner, or who's enrolled in special ed, but there's a large population of those non-farm students in those schools still would benefit from the services that are provided to those farms or special education or English language learner. Those types of programs still benefit as a whole, and the investment benefits all of them as a whole. I would say this, and again, I'm not the superintendent, nor am I the president of the Board of Education, so I can get away with saying this. The reality is, from my perspective, and this is the reason why we recommended the additional funding that we did, with balanced resources and with not jeopardizing, this is just my words, again, it's not what they're saying, without jeopardizing the fact that you have some of those subsets that are in some of these higher performing schools and not taking that money away that would help to support them, unless we have additional funding that can then go to wrap around those students who need the additional help, we're picking and choosing. And the reality is that we, and that's the reason why we as the Kerwin Commission recommended the amount of funding that we did, is because that's the only way for us to get at those students and those high pockets of poverty, the concentrations that you talked about, and the additional investment, which is why your recommendation, I think, is great in the sense that additional funding, and I again, we don't have to nitpick it here, but the additional funding, I think, should go to the current initiatives around what is there for supports of our children with the highest need, which means focusing that money to those particular areas because it's already worked in the compensatory formulas for there. So working under current resources that we have, it doesn't make sense to then shift money from some of those to some of the other schools. It would if we knew that there was never going to be a recourse and there was never going to be an additional investment. We'd have to figure it out, right? Because at the end of the day, if that end game wasn't coming, then we're going to have to figure out how to make it happen. And so then Dr. Bonner-Tompkins' recommendations certainly are exactly on point. Not that they're not on point, but that would be what we'd have to do. We do have a little bit of a reprieve in that we have Kerwin funding that I think and hope and pray will come from the state that will help us to allow for us to keep that funding at some of our schools that have lower pockets of poverty, but those children still need that additional investment, and highlight and focus our additional money should not be spread out. It should be focused on those particular schools that have those high concentrations of poverty because that's where the greatest need is. Now, again, that's one person's opinion, right? So I'm not speaking for the council, nor am I speaking for the education committee. I'm just speaking as Craig Rice. But that's where I see the blend between where Dr. Bonner-Tompkins is in terms of her recommendations and where I see kind of your conversation about protecting some of those children that are benefiting from compensatory education dollars going to other schools that may not be of the highest need. So that's, and so I just wanted to put that out there. Let me turn to Councilmember Navarro, who's been very patiently waiting.
Okay. I guess what I'm trying to do is figure out how do I explain this when I go out into the community. Right. Because there's been just a lot of focus on, the size of our school system and the needs that exist. And of course, now there's a lot of conversation about, who gets to go to which school and what does that mean, et cetera. And so the buzz that I hear is, okay, so MCPS, has this particular budget that is almost half of our, budget. And then people wonder, well, wait a minute. So if we have this growth in students who are affected by poverty, and we still have this achievement gap, and we're working really hard, why isn't that this money, how come it has not been targeted in those areas that we need? Recognizing that we as a group have always gone above and beyond. I mean, that's something that, hope the state recognizes when they're doing their work. We've gone above and beyond. Every year we go above and beyond. But since the numbers keep growing and they're exacerbated, then logic would dictate that then we would also, meaning the school system, would say, all right, well, yeah, we do have this concentration. We've had it for a long time. We have that map. It hasn't changed. So therefore, we need to be able to specifically target this money, knowing that we're always going to add more, et cetera. So how do I explain that in lay terms to that parent who is out there, reads the report, hears even this conversation, right? And says, to me, it just should be just a straightforward thing, 10% of the service group dollars, 80 million for ESOL programs that serve the 18% of MCPS students with limited English proficiency, that really stands out, because as we've always hear about 60-something% more of ESOL students are U.S. citizens, so people are like, wait, that doesn't make any sense. What's going on? So how do we explain that in layman's terms, and how do we figure out then a different way of doing things? I mean, just because other jurisdictions do it in Maryland doesn't mean we need to do it that way. So that way it's a little bit easier for folks to kind of track, okay, this is how we're funding what we're funding, and as a taxpayers, I'm cool because it makes sense.
So each of the last 3 years, as I've submitted budgets to you, we've done exactly what you just described. Moved a disproportionate amount of money, whether it's money that we have saved in our budget, probably 30 million plus over the last 3 years, or new money that we've asked you for, or reallocated money, redirected money that we have been doing just what you've described. And for example, this year in the budget, there is close to 70 new staff members around English acquisition, and there's more support for schools with high poverty, and in those places. Last year, we did a pretty significant increase in reducing class size in focus schools and non-focus schools and Title I schools, but we still have differentiated staffing in each of those. So we put a lot of money in those schools at 35% or greater poverty last year, and we continue to build out things like that each year. It will be incredibly helpful if the plan that Mr. Rice just laid out comes to fruition, and we have both the broad ability to support students in every school, especially those students in poverty, as well as in very focused money in schools with the highest concentrations of poverty. When you look at the resource allocation, it shows very clearly what's happening there, and we didn't at all shy away from the brutal facts. It does go back, however, to something that Ms. Evans said, which I think is particularly important, in which I've worked with 15 board members now, and I've heard it from every one of them. And I think it's completely true about this community, and that is that we absolutely have to both maintain the excellence that it's known for so long, for so many, and we have to bring about greater levels of equity that will create excellence for even more students. And in fact, the only acceptable answer to that is all students. And we have a couple of examples here we'd be happy to show you where we think we're moving in the right direction that support what the future might look like in doing this, if that would be acceptable.
So how do I answer that question? If a parent asks me, reads the report and says 10% of its service group dollars, 80 million for ESOL programs that serve the 18% of MCPS students with limited English proficiency, how do I answer that question?
We say we're providing that money across the entire system, and those children, right now we have 37,000 children that are being served or monitored, 30,000 English learners who are getting direct service, and we need to increase that level of service, and 7,000 who have recently exited within the last 2 years. And so we're providing that level. We're also providing tremendous levels of support around ESOL transition counselors, and other levels of support in our community for families around language. And so when you look at that, I understand that number, but when you spread that money across 208 schools, because we have ESOL programs in virtually every school, not every single one, but we're very close, and we can send you the exact number. It is you can't divide it by the number of ESOL students, and that doesn't work. You have to provide the support across the entire community, and we're going to continue to build on that as we move forward. That's what it comes down to.
Right, and I appreciate that. I served on the board for 5 years, so I understand how that
Absolutely,
works.
yep.
I just think that we have to find a way to be able to explain this so that people, lay people, whoever it is, taxpayers are clear that, wait a second, why is it then that it only served, the 10% of that money served, the 18% of these students? Because what we're reading and what people are really concerned about, on the ground is this, continuing challenge for our ESOL students and our farm students and, our special ed students. And so as we all know, that's very personal, but it also translates into, okay, what do we do about that, right? And,
Absolutely.
And inevitably, the answer is we need more resources. And I said this in the last meeting, okay, so what is that number? Like, what does that number look like? Is it $15 billion? Like, what is that number where we finally say, this is the number that will get us to eliminate these disparities? So absent that conversation, then it's so important to be able to then fully, show, demonstrate, explain, especially because we do have a growing parent community that maybe has not been as involved, but now they're becoming more and more involved, that can then look at this and go, wait, what's happening? And that, I think, it's something that we have to do better, because it's glaring and it makes people wonder, and then it makes people question, and we don't want to go down that route. So I'm just offering that because I understand that there's a lot of complexity, but there has to be a way to be able to read that and then point to it's here, where where the investment is, and this is why we can then say we're going to have to then beef this up or complement this with some other local money, or we're going to have to partner because we know that's working. I still struggle with that because I think that continues to be some of the thoughts out there.
Well, I think one of the most important things that I say regularly to groups across the community is we have to maintain both excellence, the highest levels of opportunity and rigor in every school, and we have to, no matter where the student or group of students is, we have to support them to move up. That combination of things, you can't remove the excellence from schools, you can't move, and we've got to continue to beef up the equity like I described that we've done over the last 3 years.
We have never, as long as I know I've been in public service, have never advocated for that. And I think that's a false equivalency that, somehow when we target resources and or really lift up and put a spotlight on our, low-income students of color, or that somehow it's going to affect the excellence that we have always, protected. This issue that excellence, excellence is not as if it's finite, right? It's not a pie. It's like we can really do it, and we've done it. And so I think that always comes up, and and I always want to make sure that we kind of push back. But I also have to be mindful that, again, when you look, and you said this in the beginning, Dr. Smith, that we can talk about the demographics, and that's important, the students' numbers, but it is about our students.
They're our students.
The reality is that it is about our students. Just so happens that the majority of our students are, students of color, who are disproportionately affected by this opportunity gap, right? And so we need to understand that the conversation in some ways does have to shift, because the burden is on us to make sure that we are, responding to those needs.
Well, I'm not talking about an abstract idea when I talk about excellence. I'm talking about the actual programs in schools, and we'll show you some data today that is about excellence. It's about rigor at the highest levels. It's about whether students need ACEs or college tracks, whether they're going into a enrichment center at the elementary or middle school, or a magnet school. All of those things have to be maintained, and they have to serve all children. And I think you know, Montgomery County is a different place than it was 20 years ago, but it's just as good of a place. The kids are just as talented and skilled and smart. The teachers do amazing work. It does mean that we have to think differently about how we use our resources and how we think about the school system. That's what it amounts to.
So I do want to make sure, time check wise, we're at 3:10. But this was an incredible part of the conversation, and so I really wanted to have that. I think that was incredibly helpful. I'm going to turn to Councilmember Jawando for a quick comment, and then we'll allow you to proceed with the rest of the presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So, perfect segue. What I'm hearing to Councilmember Navarro's point is flexibility is a part of this response. You can correct me if I'm wrong, but we obviously want every kid, every student to have access to what they need to succeed and to achieve excellence. And that with this particular issue of the compensatory funding, you see it as providing greater flexibility because you have multiple students that have multiple needs. Again, correct me if I'm wrong, but again, how do we talk to our residents, you know, and to the millions watching at home, as I say, about what this means when they see this conflicting, you know, potentially conflicting set of information. It's not backing off of the principle that we want to give every student what they need where they are, but that you think this provides you greater flexibility to do so, to not allocate it in the way that's being suggested necessarily by the OLO report. Is that a fair characterization?
That is, and in fact, in 2003, when the Bridge to Excellence was passed, what they did is took, I believe the number was 16 restricted grants, and converted those into what now makes up the unrestricted funding of the school system. And while that flexibility is important, it can never be justification for not doing what we have to do around equity.
Exactly.
That's what it comes down to.
And that's my second point as you move into examples of what you're doing. Okay, great, flexibility. Then the next step is, okay, how, then that's what progress are we making? What are we not making? And what do we need to do to make more progress faster for all students? And I think that's where you're
Absolutely.
ahead here.
You're exactly right.
Perfect.
One part of what I think is a critical part, a connection for us to make here is a part of what we have to share with the community is really figuring out what we just talked about. How do we explain to them what the funding looks like so that it's serving students in a way that they understand? But the second part of this is helping them to understand what some of the specific programs are that exist in the district, because many of our parents have students in these programs but are not aware of the progress in those programs, and specifically how the progress has been outlined for some of our students who traditionally have not been able to have access or have not made gains. And so that's the second part of how do we couch this to our stakeholders to help them understand exactly how the money is being moved around. So we're going to walk through this quickly to give you some perspective from elementary, middle, and high. Quickly.
So in the elementary school, we're not going to spend time talking about the tremendous, and you've been dead center in this tremendous effort around pre-K. We have moved over 1,000 seats to full day, and we still have more kids being served now than we did 3 years ago. And thank you. That's tremendous. We have a ways to go. But I think between the county and the state, universal screening and what we've done with enrichment centers, a new curriculum that we're already beginning to see the very first, just at the end of first semester, indications of its benefit for many of our learners who haven't seen themselves in the curriculum. And we don't have any data yet to show you, but the first indications I've seen are very positive. We want to show you something, though, that is in place right now, and that's accelerated math. If you look at accelerated math, and just look at this screen for just a minute, you will see that in 2015, and I'm going to read these numbers out loud because I think they're important. We always look at percentages, numbers, and we ask our schools to say percentages, numbers, names, and faces. That's the line. We want to see percentages, but as populations grow, the number changes. So if you look we've given you the number and the percent in fourth grade accelerated math. I would tell you I wasn't here in 2015, but those actual numbers make me squirm. They make me very uncomfortable. That's district-wide. In 2020, you can see a pretty significant increase. Is it enough? Absolutely not. Are where we want to be? No. Are we headed in the right direction? That's cultural proficiency. That's instructional practice. That's pre-K. That's everything working together with our educators across school buildings to make a difference. And we see the same sort of pattern in Math 5. As we add more, as we change our curriculum in the early grades, add more pre-K, and as we continue to talk about looking for students' potential rather than where the student is today, or if she turns in all of her homework, or if he comes to school every day, as we talk about potential, I truly believe you're going to see these numbers continue to change over time. And this is just one example. You can see the same thing in literacy. You can see the same thing in enrichment in the elementary school.
Dr. Smith, if I could just very quickly, I'm going to try and do this quickly. I have to say that there is a marked shift, and part of that is in teachers' attitudes towards students. I will say that when we heard this at the Black and Brown Forum, to where students came up and said that their teacher had a mindset in which they thought, because you walked in and maybe you didn't speak perfect English, or because of the way you looked, you weren't going to be that successful in accelerated math or any of the accelerated. And so that was a barrier point, the initial barrier point, beyond preparation to get there. But that was one of the things. And so I thank my partners behind me who have worked with you to make that a point of change, because I've seen it personally. I've heard personal anecdotes of it, and it really is something that is going to help us to get to the next level.
Absolutely.
It's not just about the work that's there, because people who put in the work still weren't allowed the access, and we heard that. And so now that we have an attitude change and have people aware, and it's this whole thing around this equity and justice piece that really is having people think about this differently and think about how they're treating someone based on their initial perceptions versus the actual work that the student can do, and it's making a difference. So I just wanted to say that's a key component of it that we don't oftentimes talk about,
right.
but was talked about at the Black and Brown Forum is something I wanted to lift up here, because we need to do more of it, right? And so that's why, again, I really want to highlight that as a key part. That's where we can grow also in terms of more access.
Absolutely right. Well-intentioned, low expectations are deadly. They're absolutely deadly for children.
There we go. Okay. You were going to said you were going to read the numbers, but then you got in on the thing. I think it's important.
Oh, I'm sorry.
So in 2015, if you just look at Black or African American students, there were 92 students who participated, and fourth grade students across the system, hundreds of thousands, or I don't know how many.
12,000.
12,000. That's the number. So 92 out of 12,000, 9% that were participating in accelerated math. In 2020, you have 466 out of, I'm assuming it's like
Same thing. No, the grade levels are about 11.5 to 12.5, so they're somewhere right in there.
Which is 38.4% of that population, which are now participating, right? Okay, and then similar for Latino students, you basically went from single digits, low to 20 or in the mid 20s or 30% in a matter of 5 years, which shows two things: how bad the problem was,
right?
And then to make that level of growth in that short period of time, and then like you said, that there was concentrated effort along the way to get there, and that we still have further to go.
Absolutely. Thank you. I appreciate you doing that. I got distracted and didn't do what I said I was going to do. But it's so critically important. And the fact is, while we don't compare student groups against each other, we compare them against the standard. The difference against the standard is still great. I mean, you've never heard me say anything but that, and I never will until where it's shrinking. I want to say it's shrinking. Where it's staying stagnant, it's staying stagnant. Where it's growing, it's growing. But what we need to do is see forward progress all the time for our students. We just absolutely must. So let's talk about middle school for just a minute.
Okay. So we'll move on to middle school. And so our marker that we like to look at in middle school is, of course, Algebra 1. And we've had the conversation and been looking at following Algebra 1 for years in MCPS. And we look at Algebra 1 because this is a course that I would say we always have to look at as a gateway and not a gatekeeper. And Algebra 1 has been one historically named as a gatekeeper specifically for students of color. And so that continues to be our focus. And I just point out some recent research that we were just looking at, and it talks about how 60 to 70% of students who are placed in remedial math actually oftentimes end up being not in a sequence of mathematics that allows them to be able to be prepared for college if that's where they're intending to go, or in other cases are impacted by graduation. And so it's one that we've been talking about for a while, and I'm proud to say in Montgomery County it has continued to be a focus, but it's one that we continue to look at. In the resource study, funny enough, as we were going through it, one of the things that they focused on was, we had a little bit of inconsistency in terms of who had access to algebra after years and years and years of us actually working on this.
We had a lot.
Still, a lot.
A lot
Yes,
of inconsistency.
a lot. And so it gets to Councilmember Rice's point. The investment in continuing to always work with shifts in mindset of the adults that work with our students, who are people who make the recommendations, or who actually decide the trajectory of our students, has to continue to be an investment. And as we do that, we also have to look at the fact that we have to continue to put professional development in place for our leaders, who actually have to supervise those processes and ask the question, are we looking at recommendations alone, or are we actually being consistent in looking at what students show us they're able to do that allows us over time for us to be able to say, okay, they meet the criteria, let's give them the opportunity. And so I'll go quickly to this chart that you'll see, and this chart represents all middle school students who are taking algebra in all grades in middle school. But this chart really highlights how we have reduced the gap in access. And if you look at it, it says, enrollment has increased in the last 4 years, but also the success of students who take the course by 8th grade. So it's not just about us looking at access, but we also have the responsibility to look at how students are performing, because we can open the gates, but if we don't put the right support in place, then they're sitting there but not learning. And so with that said, I'll say the example that we'll look at, the number of students who took Algebra 1 by grade 8 and met proficiency standard of 3 or higher increased by 3,153 from 5,040 students in 2016 to 8,193 in 2019. That's pretty significant. And the focus group students represented 1,136 students, which is more than a third of that increase. And so when we talk about what's working for who, this is an example of specific students in our monitoring focus groups that we look at and saying, okay, this is making a positive impact for them in a great way. So, this is an example of growth in the right direction. But again, there's plenty more that we can do and that we're looking at to see how we can continue to make those gains. And that those students are getting that opportunity so that when they get into high school, they can continue on those paths that end up being leading paths for them and not paths that restrict them.
I just wanted to highlight, and I'll turn to that. So, I've had the privilege of being with Dr. Smith a number of times for our Education Budget Forum, so I've seen some of these numbers before and seen the continued growth. I would just say, and again, so folks who, and I don't want to be Debbie Downer, but folks will say, well, access is great, performance is better. Right? And so from that perspective, while we've increased access, the performance hasn't been where we've wanted it to be, but it's increased. It hasn't increased at the same levels, but it starts with that. Right. It starts with access. And so I just want to highlight in fairness, because it is important to acknowledge the fact that it starts with getting in the door. And once you get in the door, then you can start to perform and show how you can do. And that's where we are at this point. We're incredibly strideful in terms of our access. In terms of performance, we still have a bit of a ways to go, and so that's where we want to have folks that are at the same level, although the performance has continued to increase exponentially as well, right? But it's still, exactly, but it's still, the differential is still there, so that's one of the persistent gaps. Look, again, for me, I think access is great, and so I'm all for that. I just know that folks can be like, yeah, but, and so just want to highlight that as well and know that we also know this, we acknowledge it, and we're working on that piece also.
That's such an important point. There are always 3 disparities that you're working on. The first one is getting access. The second one is, once you get access, to have the opportunity to reach proficiency, to reach the standard. And the third one is to go from that standard to the highest point. And we're always going to look at all three of those, and you're going to see examples of all three, because in this algebra one, for example, what this means is 3,153 more kids met the standard, and of that, 1,136 of them were students in poverty, students of color, or both. And that's, so while the percentage, you say, well, you went from 70% of kids meeting proficiency, and part of the problem here, which makes me crazy, is the state changed the standard from 4 to 3. But now they're going to have to relook at the whole standard anyway in the new test. But so you had 5,000 kids meeting the standard, at 70% of them are meeting that standard. You had 5,000 kids engaged, 70% of them, so that's 3,500 kids. You have 8,000 kids engaged, and 60% of them meet the standard. That's 4,800 kids. That's 1,300 more students, and I just made those numbers up, but that walk in the door having met their high school graduation requirement and can take full access of the programs Dr. McKnight was just talking about. If we look at high school, we're already seeing real growth there in access and achievement both. If you look at the trend in AP IB course enrollment, this is the access point here when we look at this. And there's just a ton of numbers, but I want to call your attention to a couple of them. When you look at Hispanic Latino students, and these are College Board numbers, so we don't break them out like we do with our focus groups. We went from 3,616 to 5,741. When we look at limited English proficient, we went from 132 to 1,305 students engaged. And we look at African American from 3,400 to 4,985. The building, and it goes back to that sense of belonging, it goes back to all of those things that we're building into the system besides just the ability to walk in the door. And we need to make it pervasive, and we need to make it forever. That this is how the culture and climate of our school system is. If you look at the next slide, when you look at the score of 3 or higher, Montgomery County has long put up numbers like this one, but we continue to outpace the state and nation with students reaching a 3 or higher. Another one of those points of disparity that you just referenced, Mr. Rice, is around STEM. Yep. We have a disparity around STEM. That needs to change. And through the work that we've been doing collaboratively around computer science, coding, all of those things, that will build that out. I mean, we're going to do a lot of things this summer with middle school students that give them that first step into that world. And we have to just constantly feel the urgency to move this stuff. I will tell you another College Board number, and we actually cut dozens of slides because we knew this was too much information. We did. But
thank you.
This number I just find both wonderful and horrifying. We had almost 700 more students engaged in AP and reaching the standard in 2 years, the graduating classes of 17 and 18. Almost 700 more in this county, African American students. The state lost 2,200 African American students, and the nation only gained 2,380 or something like that. So Montgomery County gained 1/3 of the new African American participation in the nation. That should horrify all of us. It really should. I feel sick when I say those numbers out loud. When you look at SAT, one of the things we've done with the funding that you've provided is in all 25 high schools, we have SAT school day. No one has the barrier of getting to the SAT. Everybody can take it right at their own school, and you see some substantial differences. And one of the reasons why we disaggregate the data that we do by race, culture, and poverty and separation is because we don't want to generalize. If you look at the differences between the students who are in the monitoring group and the other groups, you see very different disparities there across those numbers in 2019 in the mean SAT total score. And that should tell us where our continued work is and where our maintenance is. But right now there is no maintenance. It's just continued work. And so we really have to pay attention to that. If you look at dual enrollment, it's another area that I think holds great promise for us, for our students. We have gone from in 2013, 14, we had 200, 210. We had a few hundred to, we're almost to 900 students now engaged in dual enrollment. This year, we are going to have 14?
This past year, we had 14 students graduate with a diploma and an associate's degree. This year, we have on track to have 47. And we look to have hundreds, coming in the
future.
next few years.
First good step out of high school for every single student. That's what it's got to be. And if your first good step is the same day you get your high school diploma and you get that AA, what a difference. And that's why we've continued to add college track schools. We actually have 18 high schools that need college tracks and 18 that need ACEs. We do. And if the populations change differently, then we need to add more. So, finally, just in terms of the ELA 10, and this is not.
Sorry. Councilmember Navarro, no, I apologize.
Sorry.
Yeah, so I really wanted to point out when you were talking about the percent of advanced placement exams with a score of 3 or higher, which I think the trend is very indicative of what we were just discussing about. It's not just access, but also what happens to those students. And also it, demystifies that whole rumor out there that somehow when you open access, just waters everything down,
Right.
et cetera.
Right.
And so I think the trend is positive. Obviously, we have more work to do. So I would really, as we go through our budget process, or even before we get into it, there's a lot that we're trying to digest right now in just this one session. So I would really welcome a number of subsequent sessions to, deconstruct a little bit more some of these slides, but also understanding as then before we get into budget, how, what were the decisions made in terms of scaling up some of these promising best practices that you're seeing, right? So when we get into budget, we're constantly connecting those dots. When we're out there explaining what we're doing and how the money is being allocated, we can specifically tie it to that. Versus a very kind of broad general explanation that is very difficult for folks. So now I would welcome some more opportunities to delve a lot deeper into what you're seeing and why is it that you made the decision to expand X, Y, or Z, or scale it up. What are some of those targets that you're looking at? Specifically, it's something that I really think we should try to go into it a little deeper before we get into the craziness of budget.
Eager to do that.
There we go. I couldn't agree more, and just wanted to briefly say, because we're talking about we've made this progress, but we're not because of time. I know you'd talk all day about this, how we've made the progress. And then tie that to, okay, and I'm requesting X amount of money in X budget category to make more progress for this reason. And I think so we just need more time. And I think maybe in another session we could talk about more the how and why and how of it. And what we need to do to go further. So I just want to second that. I think that's really important.
Thank you so much. We would be eager to have that conversation, and we'll break it down however it makes sense for you, whatever you need.
Not even just that, but just for you, Councilmember Navarro, we intend, because there's so much that's happening when it comes to Annapolis and the changing paradigm when it comes to education as a whole, we really need to understand what those changes will mean for us, potential as well as actual, that you're proposing as a part of the budget. I know that you've already undertaken some of those, and so that's led to some of this. We'd like to understand what you've seen as early successes, because it also helps us in understanding what an investment in Kerwin may benefit us in terms of what we should see as a result of the investment, understanding that there's a governance and accountability model that's already proposed to be worked in anyway, but we'd still like to understand and really get a better breadth and understanding of what those things may be. So we'll be doing very robust conversations as we move forward.
If you go back one, Derek. I'm sorry, go forward one. My mistake. This is.
Yeah.
So we have 3,484 more students in each of our student populations between 2015 and 2019, so the N changes a lot. When you look at English language arts, though, each of these is a different focus population. So the first one on top is the Black or African American students who are not economically disadvantaged. What this shows you clearly is that within that PARC test, it's moving in the right direction. We had in 2015 294 students who met a 4. In 2019, we had 621 students who met a 4. That's a significant change, and you can see we also had a change from 100. For our Hispanic Latino students who are not economically disadvantaged, 270. In 15, 697. And you can see that pattern repeated for each of the 4 groups. We break down our data by school, by every level, because the goal here is not to have all the data. The goal here is not to know all the answers. The goal is to make sure students are well prepared. And when you get a 4 on the PARC test, then you are truly ready for college. You are. I helped do the standard setting for the English Language Arts 10 PARC assessment for a week in a hotel room with no windows, and I'm telling you, my first thought was, it's a wonderful, amazing, great test. And then I thought, what are you talking about, Jack? You're a 57-year-old man with a PhD and you teach English. What's a 15-year-old boy going to think of this test? And they've made some changes. I'm happy to report that we recommended to make it more appealing to a 15-year-old student, but we need to continually move all of our students to the highest level. And I think actually the upper half range of the 3 is a good indicator. When you look at all of the different metrics, we did a lot of linking studies around it and things like that. And so as the state thinks about this new assessment, I'm hoping they're thinking about the fact that you have to meet a threshold. You don't have to be an English teacher when you're in high school. And that's, I think, important. But all of these things are so critically important. We've added dual language schools. We've added much more support for our English for speakers of other languages. We've added career and technology programs. In fact, Dr. Navarro and I were in Silver Spring this morning, and we got in the elevator with someone who said, one of our delegation members wants to work with you to do a study on your aviation program at Magruder so we can try to move that out across the county and the state. And we just want to keep building things out that work for students. And so I'm going to turn this over to Dr. McKnight for just a minute, and then we'll close out.
So the next slide, just giving you a quick overview of our English for speakers of other languages, and just that you first start with look at who we're serving. And so currently we have 37,000 students who are current ESOL students or recently exited, with 30,000 of them receiving services. Also pointing out that 80% of our students who come through the International Admissions Office receive ESOL services. Wanted to point out one other program that we found success in, and that is CREA, which stands for Career Readiness Education Academy. So that program is provided with opportunities for students to learn English language skills, basic work skills, and earn industry certifications while also working towards their GED. So to give you some quick statistics, and actually these students are eligible to participate in the GED Ready pilot program as well. But to let you know how that program is working, it started in 2017, and through the 2017 to 2018 school year, the CREA evening program had 42 students enrolled. Today, CREA has a daytime and evening program at 2 schools serving 80 students with plans for additional expansion starting in February 2020, next month. So that has been one of our very successful programs, and one that we'll probably talk to you more about in terms of funding needs as we get ready for our budget work sessions that we have found have been very helpful for a number of our ESOL students, and oftentimes ones who are coming and transitioning into the system later as high school students.
Our graduation rates won't come out until the state board meeting at the end of February, which I believe is the day after our second February board meeting with the vote. One number I will point out to you in this slide about graduation is that I think is really significant. When we look at students who are identified as LEP in the cohorts, that means you have to be identified as still being an ESOL. Remember, we have thousands, and the vast majority of our students exit ESOL before they leave elementary school. Some come in upper elementary and exit middle. Some come in middle and exit in middle or exit in early high school. The ones who come in later in middle or especially in high school often don't exit before their four-year cohort graduates. That number has increased from 411 in 2014 to 1,425 this year. And I'll go back to a statement early on in this conversation, and that is, they're all our kids. We no longer approach this by saying, well, this student is going to be a dropout because they're not going to make it in the four-year cohort. Our question is, and I love that I think this is the question across the vast majority of MCPS employees, how can we add value to this student's life? Through CREA, through career opportunities, through navigation systems in the community. And actually, last spring, we had our first CREA student who successfully completed the GED right before she finished and aged out at age 20. Aged out at age 21 because she turned 21 during the school year, and so she got to be there last year. That's what we ought to be doing, adding value to people's lives every day and constantly. So we felt the urgency of the OLL report. We agree with that urgency. We wanted to talk about the complexities of it, and we wanted to share some of the information that undergirds much of what we also see in the system. But we think there are many indications that we're moving in the right direction as a school system, and we cannot back away from that for any reason. We must be committed to it and move forward no matter what it takes. So we'll stop there because it's been a long meeting for you, and we appreciate your time.
Well, no, this is incredibly important, and so oftentimes, as folks would say who want to have change, not long enough. This is something where, look, I really just want to start by saying I thank Dr. Bonner-Tompkins for her great work in highlighting and continuing to remind us of the work that still needs to be done. And so having that renewed focus on particular areas where we know we still aren't achieving all that we want to achieve is incredibly important. We've got to have our eye on the ball and know where it is that we're not meeting the needs of all of our students and focus on those. And I do believe that having this renewed sense of urgency around making sure that we're putting our funding behind those students who are the most at risk, the most vulnerable, and making sure that they're able to be successful is incredibly important. We can't forget at the same time that there are successes that happen in our system.
Tremendous. Yes.
When I think about a young man who you actually had in the picture, who I've grown to know and become quite fond of, Khalil Green, who grew up in the Germantown area, who went to Germantown Boys and Girls Club, and who is going off to do incredible things. The reality is that we know that those things consistently happen in a school system that is a great school system, right? They also happen in some schools that aren't great school systems too, right? And so while we do pat ourselves on the back and say, yes, we've done some things right, they're also happening in other schools who aren't committed and aren't doing the things that we are. So we have to be real about that. But at the same time, we are setting up a lot of kids for success. We know that when we compare ourselves not only to other jurisdictions throughout the state, but also across the nation. There's no question of that. But the reality is that's not enough, right? For us to compare ourselves to the state or, quite frankly, to the nation in this global world of competitiveness that we exist in now is just not enough. I was at a Lunar New Year celebration just the other night and was talking to parents there, a lot of which who are concerned about the quality of the system and making sure that we're not reducing the quality of the system. And I said, so if you had a company and you had an area in that company, let's say they made the widgets for the car, and the widgets weren't up to specs with all the other parts for that car that were there, where would you as an owner of that company put your money? Would you put it in the doors? Would you put it in the tires? Would you put it in the windshields? Or would you put it in the widgets that you know is the one thing that's still not there and not up to speed with making that car the best car that it ever could be? That's where any smart person would put their investment. And it's not to say you're disinvesting in all the other things, because all those other parts are great and are helping to contribute to this great overall vehicle. That's where we find ourselves. That's what the OLO report is basically saying. Put our money where we know that we need to beef up and get ourselves to the same level. We're all saying the same thing. We may say it a little bit differently and use different kinds of numbers to get there, but the reality is we all know the work that needs to be done, right? And I think that together, with us having a highlight in terms of the successes that we can do when the investment is there, and making sure that our state understands the role that they play. And I just want to put in a little plug for special education, because I will tell you one of the places in which I know personally that we're doing incredible when it comes to special education versus other jurisdictions around the world, not just in the nation, it's still woefully underfunded. And it's still, and it's so expensive, right? So I get it and understand it, which is why our state has to step up, why our federal government needs to step up and fully fund when it comes to IDEA, and really make sure. So thank you, Senator Chris Van Hollen, who continues to push that effort, because the reality is that all of our kids means all of our kids, as you said, and regardless of whether they may have a learning challenge, regardless of whether they may have a physical ailment that prohibits them from doing all the other things that our children do, that they should still be able to look to achieve the same things that all of our other kids do who don't have some of those challenges befalling them. I know you believe in that based on your own personal family, but I know that it's also something that as a superintendent you believe in as well. And so I think that we're on the same track. Thank you to the Board of Education, to all the staff members who've continued to push us forward in this realm, whether it's SEIU and MCEA, all of the folks who work together to make this system great. We've got a little bit more work to do.
Absolutely.
To make it even greater for all of our kids. Dr. Smith.
All I was going to say is I'm hopeful that the federal government, I am hopeful, will actually do what they said they would do in 1976, but they haven't done it yet. But thank you for that.
Absolutely. Dr. Bonner-Tompkins, any closing remarks from you?
No, I think that I'm happy to staff any follow-up conversations, and I think that there is still merit in the school system producing a report analogous to this that helps in a very distinct way describe what the progress is around performance as well as what the investments have been. I noted in the research for this report that the program budget that the school system used to publish is no longer the case, and so it's very difficult to pull together this information. I think that that was something that was useful to the public as well as the council, and so hopefully there will be some way to kind of restart that.
Excellent. So Dr. Smith, we'll work together on that. And then again, just to highlight some of the recommendations from the OLO report in terms of developing a resolution calling on the Board of Education to develop an integration and an equitable funding plan to address existing opportunity gaps. I'm not big on resolutions. I'm big on just saying we need to do it. It's been very clear from this committee in terms of its insistence that that's a direction that we expect. We'll be expecting that in terms of our conversations with budget. And so I think that that's been very clear and highlighted. I would like to say that when it comes to something that Councilmember Navarro said that she had addressed specifically to you, President Evans, when it comes to our equity and social justice piece, we really do want our partners to embrace that. I know you have through training and other methodologies, but really having a formal statement that that's where folks are and a policy where that's where folks are. We've been pushing MNCPPC to do the same, and so from that perspective, they were at our training that you were as well, and so we really appreciate the partnership there. So those kinds of things, again, are incredibly important. They're a part of the recommendations, and I think that we're very clear there. And then, of course, obviously, when it comes to when we get these increases, the increases are going to be targeted anyway via Kerwin. And so I think that along those lines, it will follow many of the recommendations that OLO staff has already put in. And when it comes to, again, working together from a budget perspective, we're going to have a lot of time to discuss all of the great things that are going on in the system. We'll be able to highlight a lot of the programs that are working. I'd also like to, for some of those programs that aren't, and I know this is hard, to know about some of the things that, hey, we tried and just didn't work or are being discontinued. I know that with Bell, there's some things that are happening there, and it may be changing in terms of, but those are important things for folks to know as well, right? We need to have those conversations so that people see it all and understand, and it's not saying that Bell is bad. It's great to, in terms of what, but the reality is that as we're cutting things that we see that aren't, or reducing things that aren't giving us the best bang for our buck, we need to highlight those too, so that folks know we're looking at everything. We're not just adding, but we are actually reallocating in some cases. I know that you do it, again, from the conversations that we have via our education budget forums, but I think that it's important for us in this context, in these work sessions, to have those sort of conversations as well. So I welcome those also to the mix. Anything else from?
No. Thank you.
All right. Thank you guys very much. Very productive work session. Thank you. And thank you, Dr. Bonner Tompkins. All right, we're adjourned.